I hope that this holiday season is treating you well. I hope that this past weekend was filled with wonderful celebrations, or I don't know, that you're just taking in all of the moments and magicalness of the holiday season. I certainly am. And I wanted to take a little bit of time in today's episode to reshare an episode that I recorded earlier this fall when I was just a budding podcaster and still getting the ropes or getting used to the editing process. And in that episode, I had a little slip, apparently, and I made a mistake with the editing, and it kind of messed up the content of the episode. Small business ownership and learning new things is certainly keeps you humble. Thank you for your patience with me as I am learning the ropes of podcasting and editing and all of that fun stuff. But today I am going to share with you the corrected version of that episode. And yes, the episode that I am referring to is Sowing Cover Crop with Intention. So I hope that you enjoy this fixed episode and that you're able to take some new things away from it around sowing cover crops with intention. But if you're interested in purchasing cover crop seed, you can absolutely do that. I'm going to put a link in the show notes for certified organic cover crop seed from one of my new seed company partners, High Mowing Organic Seed out of Vermont. They've got tons of amazing mixes and also just standalone cover crops. So again, check out that link. When you use the link that is in my bio to purchase cover crop seed, I get a little commission of the sales. I get like 10% of the sale. So use the link and help support my little business. And I am just so thankful that I have this relationship set up with High Mowing for 2024, all around seed sharing and sharing more information with you. So again, if you're interested in purchasing some cover crops, be sure to use the link in the show notes. It will help me out just a little smidgen, and it will help your soil out so very much. So here we go. The reshare of my 5th episode, I believe, Sowing Cover Crops with Intention. Field peas, ryegrass, crimson clover, white clover, mammoth clover, hairy vetch, buckwheat, sunflowers, daikon radish, oats. What do all of these things have in common, you ask? They are all cover crops. Today, we are going to be talking all about the magic of cover crops. If you don't know what cover crops are, don't worry. We're going to introduce these plants that you can sow pretty much year-round in your growing space that help to accomplish several things. Welcome back to the Growing Space Podcast. I'm your host, Farmer Erin, owner of the Patio Farmer, and I believe that no matter what size space you have, you can grow food at home. Tune in each week as I share my best tips, tricks, and encouragement for tending to homegrown edible plants. I'm here to support your food growing journey. So I just want to take a few moments today and talk a little bit more about the name of my podcast, the Growing Space Podcast. The reason why I chose the growing space is because this is the term that I use to describe any space that either I'm tending or a client space tending with edible plants, edible homegrown plants. I prefer to call this my growing space as opposed to a garden. If you listen to my first episode, you'll know that I definitely consider myself more of a farmer than a gardener. I feel like growing space, it speaks a little broader to the practice as well of growing food. In life, in all of our learning situations, we're always growing. We're always taking new lessons and applying them. We do this really throughout our entire lives, right? As humans, constantly learning, constantly having to adjust and shift And through that learning, through that process, we are growing. And that's really how I think of the practice of growing food at home too. It's a process, right? You're going to start, and maybe that's where you are right now. Maybe you are starting the process of growing food. You're just taking in all the information. You're trying to learn as much as possible. Hey, thanks for tuning into this podcast. Keep doing it. You'll keep learning. Maybe you have a couple seasons or maybe even a couple years under your belt, but you're still growing. You're still learning. If you have been growing food your entire life, you're still learning and you're still growing. And that is the beauty to me. You can be growing something no matter what size space you have. And in growing food at home, you are also growing in your mind, you're growing in your body, you're nourishing yourself. There's so much that we can learn from these spaces in which we grow. So this was just something, that I was thinking about over the last couple of weeks as I was recording some of these episodes. I thought, let me just touch on the name, the Growing Space Podcast. So love your plants, grow, don't stop growing. Okay, back to today's content. Now, if this is a new term for you, the idea of cover crops, then let's just go ahead and talk about what are cover crops, right? A cover crop is something that you would sow pretty densely in any kind of soil. You can put cover crops in your pots. You can put cover crops in your raised beds, and you can absolutely put cover crops directly in the ground. It's fantastic. The primary reason that you would sow cover crops is to nourish your soil. So whether you are taking a break for a certain season like fall, maybe you're not growing fall vegetables, but you want to keep your soil actively working and happy and full of nutrients. That's the other reason why you might sow cover crops, is because you want to build nutrients in your soil, or maybe not just build nutrients, but modify the nutrient content in your soil. There's different cover crops that you can sow that have different impacts on the nutrient levels, and we'll talk about that in a second. And then another reason why you might consider sowing cover crops is to protect your soil. And you could make the argument that anytime you're sowing cover crops, you're protecting your soil, but this could be the real intention behind sowing your cover crops. Maybe you are concerned about weed pressure, especially if you're growing directly in the ground, or maybe you have a low raised bed that you don't want to get overtaken by weeds if you're not growing for a season or so. Cover crops can also help just lock in and hold that soil. So if we get a heavy rainstorm or it gets really windy, you're not going to lose soil that you've been building over time just from erosion that's out of your control. And another thing that cover crops help to protect are the bugs. And I say bugs with all the affection. I also say bugs with all the inclusivity. So big bugs, little bugs, they are all appreciative of a little extra cover crop. Pollinators, if you sow something that flowers in a particular season, like buckwheat or crimson clover, oh my gosh, any kind of clover, it's just a delight for the little honey bees and the solitary bees, and everybody just loves some clover. So clover's great. There are also other reasons why clover is great, which I'll get to in a sec. Sowing cover crops and having something actively growing in the soil, so now we're talking about the roots of our cover crops, is great for building your soil microbiome, maintaining healthy bacteria, healthy fungi, mycorrhiza, even like big bugs like earthworms are super happy when the soil is super happy. Sowing cover crops is a great way to just look after all of the microorganisms and bigger organisms that are hanging out in your soil. Now, there's a couple of considerations when you're trying to decide which cover crop to use and how you should go about sowing. So as you're thinking about a cover crop, You want to first think about its intended purpose or the solution that it's providing to you. So if it's just as a placeholder for a season, that's great. Most likely you could use like a cover crop mix that's ideal for your climate and also the time of year. So that's another consideration. The second consideration for growing or sowing a cover crop is the season that you're looking to sow it in. So there are cover crops that are great for warmer weather, like sunflowers and daikon radish or tillage radish, buckwheat as well. So those three are great for warmer weather. When I say warmer weather, I mean like going from spring to summer, summer to fall, not necessarily like things that would overwinter. Now, you always have the option of overwintering or leaving your cover crops in the soil through the winter, even if they look a little dead, a little crispy. That's still great. There's a lot of cover crops that are considered green manure. And actually, you could make the argument that all cover crops are considered green manure, just in the fact that it's something that grows and then you can cut it and leave it right where it was growing. And as it breaks down, those plants then feed the soil around them and under them. A third consideration is your crop planning. So if you are looking to practice crop rotation, which is the idea of having a plan in place for the entire year of where you're going to plant certain things, working in tandem with how those plants absorb nutrients from the soil. This is a really popular practice among organic growers, organic farmers, even home gardeners, home food growers. Look at me using the word gardener. It's okay. It's okay, because I assume that a lot of you consider yourselves gardeners. But if crop planning and crop rotation is part of your annual practice, then cover crops can be super helpful to plug into this. In this next section, we talk about the different cover crops and why you might choose certain ones over others. Okay? But before we get to that, let's just take a quick little break and hear from our sponsor. Hang on. We'll be right back. The Growing Space podcast is sponsored by Plant Club by the Patio Farmer. Plant Club by the Patio Farmer is a monthly subscription service I started in 2020. I just celebrated 3 years of running Plant Club, and I absolutely adore Plant Club. I am so grateful to all of my members. I even have some who have been with me from the very beginning, so special shout out to y'all. A Plant Club is a membership-based opportunity to take your growing journey to the next level. With 4 different membership options, you get to decide the amount and kind of support that's right for you. All Plant Club members receive access to my online community through a platform called Circle. Having access to this platform allows members to share pictures, ask questions, celebrate harvests, and get to know each other. Plant Club members also have access to free seeds each month, along with information on how to plant and tend to their crops, with seeding instructions and downloadable resources from the Patio Farmer's Resource Library. Membership starts at just $14 a month. Join Plant Club today by visiting my website, thepatiofarmer.com/membership, and I'll put the link in the show notes as well. So I was just talking about crop rotation and why sowing cover crops would be a good rhythm or part of this crop rotation. This will also start off the portion of this podcast where I share why you might want to plant certain cover crops over others. So first, we will start with legumes because these are perfectly aligned with crop rotation plans. Examples of cover crops that are legumes would be any of your clover. So your crimson clover, which is just stunning, you guys. It's like bright red little flowers, little like spherical flowers on top of soft, fluffy green plants. It's just beautiful. And like I said earlier, the bees and pollinators adore crimson clover. So clover of any kind, it can be crimson, it can be Dutch white clover. I even had like a mammoth clover this year. It was just so lovely. Also, any peas, field peas, or any other pea that could be part of a cover crop mix is great. Cowpeas are sometimes used as cover crops, which is fantastic. Also, hairy vetch. Can we just have a moment for the name hairy vetch? I don't know why it makes me giggle, but hairy vetch is also a legume. It is just a lovely plant. It has a cute little flower. But legumes are great to use as cover crops because their little roots actually create nitrogen in the soil as they grow. It's fascinating. They have little nodules and they just churn out nitrogen left and right. So any legume, whether it's a cover crop or you're sowing like snap peas in the spring, or you've got some runner beans going in the summer, following those with something that really loves nitrogen, like a leafy green, like a kale or spinach or broccoli or cabbage, something like that, something that we eat the leaves of, is a really beneficial rotation. Do a legume and then do something that loves a lot of nitrogen. Now, on the flip side, if you added a lot of compost or you feel like your soil maybe has too much nitrogen, yes, it is possible to have too much nitrogen and you want to like maybe dial it back a little bit. Sow something that's in the grass family. So like a winter wheat, winter rye, ryegrass, oats, barley even you could use as a cover crop. There's even like Sudan grass. Sudan grass would be good to use in the summertime, but like a winter wheat, these are hard words to say. Winter wheat and winter rye, say those two 5 times fast. Winter wheat and winter rye are great grasses to grow in the cooler weather, that more cold hardy, takes tons of nitrogen from the soil. They also grow really quickly, so you'll have great coverage to help lock in your soil, prevent erosion, help to modify the soil chemistry to be less nitrogen rich. Another cover crop that you might consider, especially if you're growing in our lovely Carolina clay. So for those of you who don't know, North Carolina and other parts of the Southeast are blessed with a gorgeous burnt orange, dense, some might argue rock-like, but not like crumbly, gravelly rock, just like solid cement-like soil. It's a clay soil. We have a very dense, compact clay soil here in the Carolinas. And that is actually quite a blessing, I will say. If you can unlock the power of your clay soil, of your native clay soil, there are so many nutrients that are bound up in that clay. They just need a little love. They just need some aeration and some drainage to release those nutrients and start working for you and supporting your plants as best they can. So a cover crop that is fantastic for breaking up the clay, working for you, is the daikon radish or a tillage radish. They're very similar, if not identical. So daikon radish, if you haven't seen it, is quite large, huge, a huge root vegetable. And it works as a great, like, natural tiller. So you sow it and it grows those super deep tap roots, breaks up the soil. So if you're dealing with a really compact in-ground soil, tillage radish for a cover crop, it'll be great. It'll be great. One other cover crop that I want to mention as being a really great, really helpful choice is sunflowers. I know. Beautiful fields of sunflowers. You thought that they were just there for the photo op, didn't you? It's okay. I mean, most likely they are there for the photo op. I mean, who wouldn't stop and take a picture in front of a beautiful field of sunflowers? Random side note, sunflowers are my favorite flowers. They're just so happy. So sunflowers also have a great effect on our soils when we use them as a cover crop. They're really good at taking in salt from the soil. Plants, just like us, they need the right amount of nutrients to thrive. Any soil that has a salt imbalance or another nutrient imbalance can be modified with sunflowers. And sunflowers, of course, grow best in the summer. Also, mustard greens are known as being a heavy feeder. So they really pull a lot of nutrients out of the soil. So if you're working with a native soil and you're working to kind of reclaim control of the nutrients in your soil, consider using mustard. It'll just kind of give you a clean slate. So those are some different cover crops that you could consider for specific purposes. So sowing them with intention. But, if you just want to keep your soil working, you don't really have a specific goal or a specific intention for using cover crops other than you're listening to this episode and you're like, oh, I guess I need to sow some cover crops if I have my raised bed and it's empty, then you can really use just any cover crop mix. Some of my favorite cover crop mixes have blends of the ryegrass, the winter rye, field peas, hairy vetch, and clover. So it gives you like this well-balanced source of quote unquote green manure to sow for a season and then reap the benefits the next season. So I will put some articles and some links in the show notes, so be sure to check those out. I have an article that's published by Southern SARE, and SARE is a great resource. SARE is actually an acronym. It stands for Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education. They work all across the U.S., usually in specific regions. But there's a great article all about cover crops for sustainable crop rotations. And it's got other links to learn even more about cover crops. I'm also going to share with you 2 links to some of my favorite cover crop seed. So keep your eyes peeled in the show notes for those as well. So next week, it's going to be all about garlic, all the things you need to know from start to finish. From sowing garlic to harvesting garlic to curing garlic. But I would love to hear your garlic growing questions. I've got probably, half a dozen questions already to answer in next week's episode from clients and people who get my newsletter, people who follow me on Instagram. And I would love to hear your specific questions. So I will put the email address down in the show notes, but it's just the Growing Space Podcast at gmail.com. So again, the Growing Space Podcast at gmail.com. And when you send me your questions, just make sure you put like something about garlic in the subject, just so I have it and it's flagged for next week's episode. You can also always, anytime, send over a question that you have about anything that you're growing. I absolutely love questions. I really do. And there's no such thing as a silly question. So like I said, I will put that email address in the show notes, but it's just the Growing Space Podcast at gmail.com. And the sooner you send over those questions, the sooner I'll be able to include them in the episode. So yeah. The Patio Farmer is a small business. I'm a solopreneur and I rely on customer support and client support. If you subscribe to my newsletter as a paid subscriber, you can either pay $5 a month. That's like these days, that's less than a cup of coffee. So $5 a month, or if you want to invest $50 for the year, you actually get some savings there. You save about $10 a year. You can subscribe to my weekly newsletter. It's called the Queen City Almanac. And you can also subscribe to my newsletter for free. You don't have to be a paid subscriber. But if you want to support me and my business and this podcast, I would love for you to be a paid subscriber. You also get special bonus perks from me throughout the year. Once a season, I'll send you a little freebie. So yeah, I'll put that in the show notes as well, the link to become a paid subscriber. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode. At the end of every episode, I like to share just a fun fact, a little tiny morsel as we sign off for the day. This week, I wanted to talk about native bees. I had mentioned planting cover crops as a way to look out for the bees and plant something that can be an early snack for them in spring. And so I thought we could sign off with a fun native bee fact because I feel like a lot of people don't really know a whole lot about our native bees, including myself. I'm still learning, but I have a couple little facts to share with y'all. Did you know, for example, that 90% of all of our bee species here in the US, which there's between 3,000 and 4,000 different species of bees here in North America. Crazy, I know, right? But 90% of those species are solitary bees, meaning they don't live in hives. They may have like small colonies for a portion of the year, but for the most part, they just kind of hang out by themselves and they do their own thing. And most solitary bees hibernate in underground burrows through the winter. So if you're ever wondering to yourself, why don't I ever see bees in the winter? It's because they're hibernating, kind of like bears, like little pollinating honey bears with wings. Sometimes they have cute stripes, sometimes they don't. And if you're interested in learning more about native bees, I have 2 resources for you. I will put these in the show notes, but just wanted to call those out here as well. So one is the Xerces Society. They are great advocates for all things native bees, and they do a lot to just raise awareness and education around native bee populations. And then another resource for you is a book called The Bees in Your Backyard. And I actually heard about this book on a podcast. I listen to Ologies by Allie Ward every week. It's fantastic. If you love to learn about a variety of different things, you should definitely check out Ologies podcast. But recently they did a whole episode on native bees, native melitology, I believe. So I'll link to that episode. And the guest on that podcast was someone who studies native bees, and they recommended the book, The Bees in Your Backyard, which you'll be happy to know is currently sitting on my bookshelf. And also, since we're on the subject of books on my bookshelf, I'm going to give just a quick little teaser for a mini series that I have planned for November for this podcast. And I'm going to share with you all of the books on my bookshelf. I'm obsessed with books. I love books. I love nonfiction books. Books about, of course, like food growing and homesteading. But I have lots of books on my bookshelf that I find really helpful and that have been great resources and references to me throughout my growing journey. And so in November, I'm going to give you a little mini series about all of those books. So hang on for that. Okay. Well, as always, thanks for being here. Thanks for sharing your growing practice with me. And next week, tune in for all things garlic. Don't forget to send me your garlic questions. You can email them directly to me at thegrowingspacepodcast@gmail.com. Okay, have a great week. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed that reshare of the episode. There's so much goodness that comes from cover crops. I love them. Very restorative, very appropriate for the winter season. Oh, happy official winter season to you. And I will also just share before we close out, I just wanted to give a quick reminder that if you are interested in getting my 2024 planning calendar called Growth, then be sure to join Plant Club. I would recommend joining at the grow level, but really joining at the no, grow, or whoa levels will get you the calendar. So just one final reminder for Plant Club membership before we officially turn the page and enter 2024. Thank you for being here. If you enjoy listening to my podcast, please be sure to like it or give it a little review, subscribe, share it with a friend. Enjoy the rest of your 2023. I hope you all have wonderful and safe plans for celebrating the new year, ringing in fresh starts. And I will see you, not to be too cheesy, but I'll see you next year. Okay, you guys, take care.